everyone. I'm Alani Foxcroft, and today we will be discussing the 2021 State of Software Developer Nation survey by Offerzen. With me is Maarten Kruger from Tech Genius. Welcome, Maarten. And today we will be discussing frameworks.
Thanks, Melanie. So if I can just open the report, it's quite interesting. So what they're doing is they're comparing the popularity of frameworks, what's currently used the most, and what is the most wanted frameworks that developers actually want to work in. So the interesting thing to note here is that some of these frameworks are front-end frameworks, and some of these things are back-end web frameworks. So if I can just quickly annotate here, so these ones, Angular is basically a front-end framework as well as React. So these are front-end frameworks. So what this report is telling us is that Angular and React are the two most popular ones. But I think before I go into more detailed discussion, I would just like to explain what a front-end framework is, if you don't mind. Can I go on with that?
No problem with that.
Okay, great. So I'm just I prepared something. I think one can become very theoretical about this thing. So to try and keep things simple, and please interrupt me anytime you want, is just to sort of explain how web technologies evolved. It makes it a little bit easier to understand. So basically, a web page consists of something that's HTML. Now, HTML is an abbreviation for hypertext markup language. Now, typically you have one HTML. In the beginning, you had one HTML file per page. So you can think of it like a Word document where you have a document per page, basically. So on a very basic level, the hypertext markup language will say, for example, you've got a heading. So H1 is a header, that's the largest size. And then you say you have a paragraph basically of information. Now, that it basically just puts all your components on a specific page. Then what they did is they said you can also do styling. So for example, you can say your button is blue, your header is white, whatever, and set the font size, etc. So things were becoming very cluttered. So what they started doing is to say you have the style sheet. We call the CSS cascaded style sheet. So instead of having this cluttered HTML document with styling in between, you put all your styling. You would say over here you've got a heading, hello world, and you've got a button 1. And over here you would say, okay, your headings are blue and your your paragraphs are white, for example. And then if you click on a button, what must happen when you click that button? That is now where the coding comes in, and this is runs in your web browser. Now this is done in the language JavaScript. So every website, basically, every web page uses some HTML for putting the components in a specific place, the CSS file for styling, and then the programming for JavaScript. So this is what it looked like in the beginning. Then things evolved from there. Oh well, so this is if I were to create those web pages on my own PC, I just open it from my hard disk. Nothing's happening over the internet. Now, what's happening in reality is obviously you're not opening your website from your own PC, you're opening it from a remote server. So you're downloading the page. Every time you used to visit a page in the beginning, you would basically, the About Us page would be, the HTML file would be downloaded to your PC and would open your web browser. Usually all the JavaScript for all the web pages would be downloaded once in the beginning, and also the styling for all pages would download once, and your browser would then cache it. So you basically and this information is being downloaded through something that's called the HTTP connection, which is a hypertext transfer protocol. But everybody these days are using HTTPS, which is a secure connection. So if you go to a banking website or any website these days, you should see that little padlock, which basically means that this information which is going from the web server to your browser is being transmitted securely. Nobody can intercept that or hack that information. It's all confidential. Does it still make sense at this stage? Can I go on?
It does make sense. Thanks, Maarten.
Okay, great. So the next step then is these things started evolving a little bit further. So the thing that I want to show you is the next step was that instead of downloading an HTML file for every single page, these files then started to be generated on the web server. Now, this is quite interesting because let's say, for example, you have 1,000 people visiting your website and they're from 1,000 different locations. What you can now do is you can check the IP address of every visitor, determine its location, and you can show different content to every user because it's not just one HTML file that's being, the same HTML file being downloaded to every web browser. You're generating each time it's requested. So the great thing about this is you, for About Us page, for example, you can have one generator, which is called a controller. And depending on certain variables, you can make that same, you can make different variations of an About Us page depending on where a person is in the world. So
Wow.
the developer develops one page that can dynamically adapt based on certain parameters or variables that it gets. So,
Wow.
we really started seeing a separation between what's on the server isn't exactly just what some content that's directly downloaded to the web browser.
Yes.
So the other thing that started happening is, let's say there's a contact page that wants to submit information back to the web browser. That information is then sent as a model. So a model is basically a packet of information that's structured in a very specific way. So if on a contact us form, you would say that that specific model contains certain fields like telephone number, contact us, telephone number, email address, and what the query is on the specific person. So you know what that packet of information looks like. So the controller on this side knows when it's getting something from the contact us page, it should look in that specific way. You know, that's a model. It receives a packet of contact us information. Now, if it wants to save that in a database on the web server, you can have another packet which says, you know, a contact query model, for example, and you can define a table in a database that's dedicated to that specific kind of information. So now what's also happening is your controller is starting to become something that's separated from the database through models. So in other words, what started happening is you can change this model and it will automatically update the database. So you didn't have to go, so the database sort of starts to get automatically created. So that was sort of the next evolution in web technologies.
And that's quite a big one.
Yeah, that is quite a big one because now suddenly your source code in your database, you didn't have to maintain two things anymore. You can just change the model in the source code and they call it the database migration. Now migration basically means go look at the database, whatever way it was before, go to change the structure so it's basically conforms to the way that I've changed the model. And the same with a view model, you know, if you change the model on this side, it will automatically change that side. Let's say you want to add a field like, I don't know, you have to specify what city you're in. Then you can just go add it to this model and basically get, so it was a step in the right direction. But, okay, well, before I get to the but, let's just see where things will evolve thereafter. So now we're still, the technology is pretty much very similar over here. I just want to explain that what was added then was something that's called Ajax. Now, Ajax is an acronym for asynchronous Java and XML. Now, you can just ignore what that is. What it basically means is that before you would download an entire HTML file, sure, it's dynamically generated on the web server, you receive it, but there's basically one HTML or one view being created for every single page. Now, let's say you have something that's quite dynamic, like a chat page, like chat with somebody online. So this page would then be downloaded to your web browser, and you can now start, entering information here and chatting. Now, every time you send a message to the server, you don't want that page to reload because it would be slow and clunky. Every time you click enter, the whole page would refresh. It wouldn't be a nice user experience. Yes. So Ajax basically enabled it that they can just send that model, that message that you typed in as a model to the server, and then the server can respond and say, give a message back, and it's dynamically updated on your web page without the page reloading. So this is also a game changer because now suddenly web pages started becoming dynamic. And then it went to the next step, which is pretty much where we are today. And it's a little bit.
Is this your butt? Is this your butt that's coming now?
I can't even remember what my butt was. What did I say again? I can't remember. Anyway, let's see if I just sort of get to it naturally. But anyway, so what happened over here is it's basically a big evolution. The big takeaway here is that where before you used to have one controller on this side linked to one page over there. So let's say your website has got 20 pages. If you do anything on the front end, you need to do it on the back end, you need to do the same thing on the front end. Mm-hmm. And what they've done is, this is quite quite an incredible evolution, is that you're saying what's happening on the back end is completely separate from your front end. The two systems are completely separate. And now we get to the word which we were trying to get to framework. You have a framework on your web server, which we call also a backend framework. And then you have a separate framework sitting in every web browser. And these two things are talking to each other. So it means that in theory, you can take a backend framework, you can chuck it out, put in a completely new one using different technology, and your front end framework will work exactly the same as before. And you can do the same thing with your front-end web framework, where you can chuck it out, use a completely new technology, and everything will still work perfectly because the backend, is still exactly the same as before. Now,
that is very good. That's very impressive.
Yes, and the big takeaway is, if you do it this way, it means, let's say 50% of your development cost went into front-end and 50% into back-end. If you want to, if technology evolves and you want to use a new backend system, you only have to, and let's say you have to redevelop everything from scratch, there's only 50% of the redevelopment cost, instead of the entire 100% of redeveloping the front end and the back end.
Got you.
So this is made possible by, on the back end, you put something that's an API, that's an abbreviation for Application Programming Interface. Now, this is something that we discussed, we touched briefly on in a previous video, but an API is basically a standardized way of communicating. So let's say, for example, the front end can go ask for a specific client's name. Doesn't matter what's happening behind the scenes, it will just give you back the client's name. So it doesn't care what framework is sitting behind that API. You can have anything running in any language. It doesn't really matter. And so, and you can use any front-end framework because it's still going to ask for a client's name in exactly the same way. Now we get to the names, basically sort of the names of what are these frameworks called. Now, okay. When we get to the front-end frameworks, there are basically three big ones at the moment. And it's basically Angular, which was, Angular 2.0 was basically developed by Google. And then you get something that's called React. Now, behind React is pretty much Facebook, that were the drivers of developing that framework. And then you get Vue, which sort of started off as a spin-off of Angular. So these are three popular front-end frameworks. Mm-hmm. And then on the back end, it's not the main focus of this discussion, but just to sort of put it out there, on the back end, your very popular back-end frameworks is .NET, and then something a new iteration of .NET that's called .NET Core. That's basically Microsoft is behind that. And then you get basically Node.js or Python. So those are your backend frameworks that are very popular at the moment.
Got you.
So that's a quick summary of how web technology has evolved and where the front end, what sort of front end frameworks there are today. So if we go back to this report and start looking at popularity, then you can see that at the moment about Angular, so the only two front-end ones here are Angular and React. So Angular is currently sitting at 26% roughly, and React is sitting at 22%. So it means that there's Angular at the moment is more widely used than React, but what is quite interesting is that if you take a look here and see that what do people want to use, then the desirability of Angular is going down and the desirability amongst developers are going up for React.
Yes.
So it means it almost looks like there's a shifting in. So if these desired technologies becomes a reality in a year from now, you're going to see React overtaking Angular. That's interesting. It is interesting, and the other thing that's sort of interesting is that both of these are developed in JavaScript. These frameworks are JavaScript frameworks. So the big difference here is that Angular is quite a big framework. It gives you everything out of the box, but the learning curve is longer. So for a developer who's got a JavaScript background can learn to develop in Angular in a 2 to 3 month period, roughly. And then the other thing is to do a project in the front end with Angular as a front end framework. It's going to do more coding than React. Now, React is quite a lightweight front end framework, and it doesn't give you all the functionality that Angular gives you out of the box. And also means that you can do a project where you just do a little bit in React and you don't do everything in React, which isn't possible with Angular. You have to do the entire front end in Angular. So this is the quick and easy way. And yes. This is sort of the more do it right properly, So now the thing that's interesting to note here is that people are tends to want to move from doing things properly to doing things quick and easy.
I think that's the state of today, Maarten.
It is. And the other thing that you also, so people want to take the quick and easy route.
Yes.
Now, whether that's a good or a bad thing is up for debate. There's also, these two are very, you've got big communities around both of them. And people are, the people are quite adamant on insisting that there's the best. So there's a lot of pride in these frameworks as well. You don't find people just chopping and changing every day. Now, I'm just going to quickly show you, I'm going to overwhelm everybody with lots of information, but
that is a very long timeline.
Yeah, I'm not going to go into detail. I'm not going to. I just want to highlight one or two things. So JavaScript came about in 1995, so it's old. It's old.
Wow.
So it's quite interesting that after all these years, all the major front-end platforms are all on JavaScript. So, yes. And TypeScript is something that was actually developed by Microsoft in 2012, which is a much more recent development. And TypeScript came about to add things to JavaScript that JavaScript couldn't do. Now, AngularJS is one of the first frameworks that were developed back in 2009, and that was AngularJS, which is purely JavaScript. Then Google came around in 2014 and said, listen here, let's take AngularJS and convert it into something that runs on TypeScript. So that was in 2014. And then you can see that Facebook basically came out with React just the year before. So in 2013, Facebook brought the React front-end framework. And the reason why they did it was because they were betting on HTML5 being something that's fantastic. There was a major change between HTML4 and HTML5. It was supposed to be revolutionary. And then Facebook betted that HTML5 will solve all their problems. And then Facebook became very slow as a mobile app as a result of it. And then Facebook said, listen here, we are going to commit to making a way to basically have our mobile apps be run much faster, and that's where React Native basically was born. So all that I want to point out here is Angular at a much earlier start. So you had a 5-year lead, well, 4 to 5 year lead on the other platforms, which is basically React and Vue. Yes, so the community, had a lot of time to establish itself. It's more of the old school way of doing things. So that's basically the short version of front-end frameworks and where we are and where the market is supposed to go into. Whether it's good or bad, That's really
We'll
much
see, I suppose.
up for debate, and
Yeah.
whether people are going to really stop using Angular over the next year and really jump on the React bandwagon. It's one thing for developers to say they're going to do it, but are they really going to do it? I think the reality is that for a lot of people who are not familiar with the front-end frameworks, it's much easier to jump on the React bandwagon. So I think, if I had to sort of venture a guess, I wouldn't be surprised if by next year React overtakes Angular.
Sure.
I think the very important takeaway that I just want to leave with all business owners or all business decision makers is that you need to be on a front-end framework. If you're considering redesigning your current website platform, if you've got a web-based system, or if you're designing or developing a new one from scratch, you definitely need to be on one of these popular front-end frameworks and also on a popular back-end framework. Because if you don't, you run serious risks into the future of the technology becoming obsolete or very unpopular. Or if you want to change something in the back end or the front end, then you have to redevelop the entire project instead of potentially just half of the project in the worst case scenario.
Which is obviously also very costly. So this is very interesting. I think next time we will tackle back end.
Great, Melanie, no problem. Looking forward to it.